Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is.
Marina Welker. I'm a professor in the anthropology department at Cornell University.
Well, Prof. W, thank you so much for being here and doing this with us. The only other person working on Indonesia who is a victim slash survivor of the podcast is my old friend Dick Roberson, who wrote Indonesia and the Rise of Capital. But you've gone into things in a more post-authoritarian moment. In any event, before we get on to that, I wanted to ask you my standard question, which is to inquire what's currently dynamizing, impeding, interesting, preoccupying you.
Yeah, so I guess what's both impeding and interesting me right now is I've recently become chair of the Department of Anthropology
Oh,
here
wow.
at Cornell. And yeah, people often offer their condolences, of course. But as somebody who studies corporations, it's actually quite interesting to, peek behind the scenes, with the stuff that I hadn't really known about or understood at the not-for-profit corporation that I've been working for almost 2 decades now. So yeah, it's fun to like get to know like what the sort of internal logics and narratives are and how they're wielded, for example, the budget model, and what sometimes, irrational and perverse consequences they can lead to. Um, and then, yeah, I think in the academy in general, we're now in a moment when a lot of kind of initiatives that we have always taken somewhat critical stance towards, while also seeking to seize and use for good purposes, are now being really dismantled. So, for example, DEI, obviously, and multiculturalism, which we've criticized for their depoliticizing impulses, or outside of the academy, thinking about environments, social and governance movements in corporations, or USAID in development, which we know has existed for U.S. instrumental purposes, but also that its dismantling has been pretty devastating. I'm in the process now, having mostly wrapped up my research on the cigarette economy in Indonesia, but still working a little bit on that. I'm thinking about developing some new, smaller, more modest projects that I can do while also being chair. Maybe work that has a smaller carbon footprint as well, that doesn't involve international travel. So, for example, I'm interested in the Von Trapp family business in Vermont. Von Trapp of the Sound of Music fame.
The hills are alive.
That's right. So yeah, they started the first Nordic skiing commercial operation in North America, and also more recently run Vermont's largest brewery, as well as have a lot of villas and lodge and other kinds of facilities like that. And so sort of studying how they go about exploiting as well as trying to preserve their family and those family memories as well as the environment. So that's one of the sort of smaller projects that I have in gestation, I guess I would say currently.
Those nuns have got a lot to answer for in getting them over the mountains, right?
Yeah.
So, Prof, just so some people, just because some people may not know, Cornell is an almost unique, perhaps unique model, isn't it? Because it's an Ivy, which connotes private, but it's also public. So I imagine that makes the budgeting all the more confusing, right?
Yeah, and I'm still getting acquainted with that. And we also have Weill Cornell, the medical school that's in New York City.
Yeah.
It couldn't be here because you wouldn't have sufficient, um, you know, populations of patients with which to run a medical school. At the same time, its existence in New York City means that it has to compete with the all the other like really strong medical schools in
Yeah.
that region. And so, yeah, what are the implications of the, dispersed nature? of Cornell and I guess of other universities as they develop global, wings as well currently.
Yeah.
But yeah, the hybrid nature of Cornell is something that when I first arrived here, having been fully public educated, from kindergarten through my PhD, I was kind of excited to end up at an institution where even though I was on the private side, it had the public dimension. But I didn't realize at the time that, being at a land grant institution also means that you're at a land grab institution. And
Yeah.
it has that history, and Cornell more than any other university actually in the United States to answer for. Um,
And this relates to the post-Civil War moment when the federal government used its alleged eminent domain to steal more and more land or whatever from native inhabitants, First Peoples and others, but then used it again to go back to your example of development aid and so on for purposes, some of which have turned out to be quite positive. I was thinking of Chris Newfield's work because Chris has done all this not very English department work inside the financial world of the UC system on the other side of the continent and has been a real irritant to the authorities because he learnt so much. In any event, Prof, thanks a lot for being with us today, as I said. And I wanted to start with a slightly awkward question that relates somewhat actually to what you said about problematic origins and purposes, but with okay outcomes. I'm thinking of Ben Anderson's memoir when he writes about being a grad student in East Asian studies at Cornell and all the funding that came from the CIA and the split in that area between people who were doing quite dirty work and people like him who just wanted to get on a bicycle or a motorbike and go to villages and meet people. And that memoir was quite a blockbuster in an academic way. And I guess it draws our attention to the way in which so many disciplines, communications, political science, anthropology, sociology, foreign languages, became part of the project of the Social Sciences Research Council and the US government to try to remake the global South in its imagined image of the United States. Long-winded prolegomena, but my sense is that none of that applies anymore.
I feel like you mean under the current Trump administration, or do you mean that it hasn't applied for some time, like
That it might be
say
in
the
the
end of the Cold War, or
right, that a lot of it goes away after the Cold War, and that there are relics of the Cold War that have provided support for all kinds of progressive social sciences work that was undertaken because of the Cold War, but still gets into appropriations bills.
yeah, I guess it's a question of how people feel that they're able to use the resources that are being made available, the constraints that they're under, how they have to, I mean, we all have to sort of package our projects for any form of funding, but to what extent are they remaining faithful to their vision of what they, want to do in their research? But I guess I feel like those histories always live with us, and we need to remember them and teach them. And I'm thinking of the very different matrix in which, ethnic studies and Asian American studies came to exist in the United States, and which is so distinct from, coming out of like, the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement and oppositional, youth student movements, which is so different than, the sort of superpower funding to know the hearts and minds of peoples in other countries in order to more effectively, directly or indirectly, exercise some governance authority over them. I think in anthropology specifically, there was a debate that surfaced maybe around the time of the invasion of Afghanistan, over anthropologists who became involved and whether or not they were part of militarizing anthropology, that is, basically allowing military goals to infiltrate and instrumentalize anthropological knowledge, or if they were anthropologizing the military and enabling, the U.S. as it was engaged in military operations to undertake them in a more sensitive fashion and maybe to have some kind of protective effect in their presence there, And I think for a lot of us, um, taking that latter position would be very challenging, but
For
there's
sure.
those who
And
have
of
done it.
course, one of the funding differences here that's interesting is that areas like ethnic studies and so on have tended to receive intramural funding from the block grants that universities get, whereas disciplines like anthropology have relied a lot on external funding because they're more expensive to undertake. You've got, unless you're going to Vermont, you often have a long way to go and a lot of time to spend there. And that must be really under threat right now. This is a very difficult time, now that I've applauded you and said well done, to be taking over a very noteworthy and fantastic anthropology department because the resources are being slashed, aren't they, by the current administration?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in some ways, we've been on more of a shoestring budget for a long time than the STEM fields have. So they're experiencing, as a colleague put it, in this kind of very, compressed fashion over 5 months, like what we experienced over 50 years. So we may, it's certainly a threat, and it's a threat insofar as, university enterprise as a whole is threatened, but maybe less of a threat in terms of our dependence on, say, NSFs. But right now we're still, it's just such a kind of ever-changing environment, right?
Yeah.
Where some grants are still in effect, but the monies aren't being dispersed. And, at any moment, it's like, oh, well, this program still exists, but you need to, remove all of this content from your proposal in order to pass scrutiny. And then the threat that things, that grants that you have could be withdrawn and whatnot. So
Yes,
it
quite
is a very fraught moment indeed.
it is extraordinary. And I wanted to ask you about something that probably got in under the wire before all of this, or sometime before. Last year, you brought out a wonderful book about Indonesia and specifically cigarette capitalism. I wanted to ask you about that book, but I wondered if we could begin actually halfway through the book. There's a wonderful moment. I'll remind you that it's in chapter 5, Prof, when you describe walking with your children and confronting extraordinary merchandising and advertising clearly aimed at children in terms of where these things were and the height that they were at physically. It's a remarkable description. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that and about doing field work with little people.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah. So I feel like it was a 10-minute walk basically to their school through these
Mm.
kind of crowded streets, but like pretty modest streets. We weren't, among like tall buildings or anything like that. Very mixed, kind of residential and little independent stores, mini marts, that kind of landscape. And so we had this little project where I was getting them involved in my research. Let's count all the advertisements that we pass, And there's some larger ones that were several meters large, no billboards. And then smaller ones like the size of, a page, that you would of a notebook. And I followed around the people who install this, in the environment. And it seems so inconsequential to put up, say, like 5 stickers in a row that, are advertising some new product, fairly low down, right? That's sort of like, let's say, hip height or something like that for an
Mm,
adult. But obviously, it is consequential for the company because they make these small stickers in the first place, and then they are very insistent that they're good citizens and they pay taxes on them. And then they pay people to install them all over the place and have programs that, incentivize um, people who own stores to agree to have their stores used as this kind of infrastructure on which all of this advertising is
mm.
going to be hung. So over our 10-minute walk to school, we counted 58 cigarette advertisements one way, which would mean, both ways, 116 advertisement exposure. And of course, you're only going to see some of them, if you're not looking carefully for them. We probably missed some even, in looking for how many we passed. But I just, compared that to walking them to school, which is, the same. It takes about the same amount of time when we were in the United States to walk them to their elementary school here, where they pass zero cigarette advertisements. And that's not true, everywhere in the United States. I mean, if you're in an urban setting, and especially a lower income urban setting, if you're passing gas stations, 7-Elevens, then you will see some cigarette advertisements. But I would be pretty shocked if anybody would pass that number of cigarette advertisements, even in US places where that's allowed. And so that to me just felt like a really fundamental form of what tobacco control activists call injustice, tobacco injustice. The fact that, in one setting, people are that targeted for messaging that encourages them to take up smoking. That's something that the cigarette companies would refute, that they are never trying to recruit new customers, but I would insist that they are. And also, if you already are a smoker, it's just an incessant reminder and provocation to smoke, or if you're somebody who's trying to quit or who has quit. So it's just examining that sort of forest of signs, as I call it, drawing on Kalman Appelbaum's work, in which Indonesians are embedded.
And when you say embedded, I guess one of the very powerful messages that I got from the book and from other pieces you've written on the topic is that there's a structure of feeling in much of Indonesia where cigarettes are crucial, and they're even part of nationalism. There's a juxtaposition between Indonesian and white cigarettes, for example. So I wondered if you could talk about that sense of national identity that connects in some way to this.
Yeah, so I think that the commodity nationalism or kretek nationalism, and maybe I should say something about the kretek, the clove cigarette,
Mm.
and its distinction, from white cigarettes. So the term kretek or kretek is onomatopoeic, evoking the crackling sound that tobacco, but clove-laced cigarette makes when you actually smoke it, because the clove fragments ignite, and so then it crackles. So that's part of the sort of sensory, experience of smoking a clove cigarette. They're also dipped at the mouth end, the tip, in saccharin, and so they have this sweetness. And all sort of regular machine rolled cigarettes that one would buy in the US or Mexico, where you are, they all have a lot of additives and flavorants, But Indonesian clove cigarettes have even more heavy flavorants, or they call it sauce, that's added to it and gives it more of a sort of density and sense of like taste and spice to it. And so, the public health messaging, the sort of orthodoxy that we're all familiar with, I would think, among your listeners, that cigarettes are toxic and they're carcinogenic and that they're addictive. That also exists in Indonesia. But there's a kind of counter discourse to it, which is that this is a kind of like when this is being applied to the clove cigarette, the kretek, then it's a kind of neo-colonial discourse that's imposing this Western public health orthodoxy on what is, in fact, this very special indigenous uh, product that is actually a part of cultural heritage. I think of commodity nationalism. I talk about it sometimes. It's like you've got sort of like light commodity nationalism, soft commodity nationalism, and then more militant commodity nationalism. So the soft commodity nationalism can just even be a sense that like this is a really critical industry for our country because it employs a lot of people. And the employment is pretty visible with it because you have 20% of this clove cigarette, or the total cigarette market is actually hand rolled. And so that's employing a lot of vast majority female workers who are hand rolling, hand packing, uh, hand trimming these cigarettes. And then you also have the mechanized factories, which employ far, far, far fewer workers in relation to their like very large lethal output. So that accounts for 75% of the cigarette market. And then white cigarettes, which means just cigarettes that don't have cloves in them, that accounts for only 5% of the market. And that was a really big shift from the sort of status of the market back in the 1950s and 1960s, when the majority of the market was actually a white cigarette market. And it was actually in the 70s when clove cigarettes started mechanizing, and the companies made clove cigarettes that looked like white cigarettes. They looked uniform, modern, clean, kind of like fungible commodities. That was when the clove cigarette industry actually took off. But it has this image and reputation that I think is organized more around the hand-rolled cigarette, which I write about as this kind of charismatic commodity that is, seen as more sort of artisanal, and then also the women who roll it are seen as very iconic and maybe endangered category of workers, insofar as they could become the victims of this, from a nationalist perspective, neo-colonial discourse of the tobacco control, and that people should stop smoking, and that higher taxes should also be applied to the industry.
You also refer to the gig economy and gig workers in this. So it's not as though the employment is also wonderful, given the precariousness of that kind of labor. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it depends a lot on the, where one is located in the supply chain, as well as in the hierarchy. So the agricultural labor, as well as the position of farmers, clove farmers and tobacco farmers in relation to the company, I think, or just the industry as a whole, I think is fairly precarious, because tobacco prices fluctuate, and then the crop is just also subject to, increasing climate change, caused extremes. The seasonal labor of workers is not very well compensated. It's also gender differentiated, and women often get significantly lower compensation than men. So that work environment, I think, is not that great. Although it's often used and cited as one of the arguments, that here are these rural subjects who rely on the tobacco industry.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I'm at pains to sort of demonstrate in the book is that you may be a tobacco farmer or a tobacco laborer, but that's usually only like one component of a bigger set of economic strategies, livelihood strategies that people are pursuing. And it is not adequate at all to provide a full livelihood. Moving on to the factory manufacturing, I would say that those workers in both the hand rolling and the machine rolling factories who are full employees of the company,
Yep.
their work, although it's difficult and it's exploitative, and there's plenty to criticize there, but those jobs are highly valued by workers. So if you have limited formal education and you're a hand rolling worker, um, in part because there has been a lot of overtime and the company actually adheres to the Indonesian government requirements for overtime pay. Those jobs are, again, just relative to other blue collar jobs, are pretty good and valued. There again, though, I think both in the mechanized and in the hand rolling factories, you need to look at where there's a contract sort of labor and operations that are occurring. So, Sampurna, the Philip Morris International subsidiary that I study, um, it has its own like company operated hand rolling factories, but then it also subcontracts to 38 uh, third party operators that as they call them. And so those are different conditions. They are pegged to local minimum wages that tend to be lower. They also produce actually higher target outputs for less money. So that complicates the picture of, hand rolling labor. And then within the mechanized factories too, I mean, there's always an effort to, find the parts of the operation that can be identified as non-core and subcontract them to other workers. Where I think that the gig economy dynamics come into play more is at the point of the branding of the clove cigarettes and getting sort of influencers on board. Um, so it's, got very similar sorts of dynamics where they're being targeted in their youth, sort of in their underemployed status. There's really a sort of, surplus of college educated, aspirational, middle class, graduates who, in their efforts to like find, some kind of employment, it's very appealing to have a cigarette company come along and sometimes hire them formally, but sometimes just give them the possibility of opportunities and get them to essentially produce value for the company without, necessarily any compensation at all. Maybe prizes, maybe connections that will serve them. So I think, yeah, that's where the sort of gig dynamics come into play.
Actually, for years, I don't know if it's still the case, tobacco companies gave Hollywood actors, in inverted commas, lifetime supplies of cigarettes in returning for having the packages, as people say in the United States, or packets on display during photo shoots and interviews by magazines. One of the many virtues of this book, it's a wonderful book, though demoralizing in many ways, is that you take us through the entire life of the commodity sign, as you've done, but in reverse order, during our discussion. You take us through making the stuff, marketing the stuff, selling the stuff, and using the stuff. And this, I think, is an absolute model for understanding capitalism at all ends of the story, supply and demand. Really fantastic. In that light, I wanted to ask you about that moment when science and medicine meet cultural nationalism, something we see with environmentalism often, and something that you've encountered, this notion of there being something neo-colonial about pointing out the extraordinary health risks that people run, not only by smoking, but being anywhere near it. And I wondered about your take on that and your experience of that personally as someone in the field for an extended period.
Um, so I guess one is also, potentially, I mean, so one question that, people have asked me is like, did I smoke, in the course of doing this research? And I didn't. The one context in which I was kind of felt like it would be interesting to do so was with the master blenders who were training, apprentice blenders, and that there's an art to learning that blending and smoking as a blender, much like one tastes wine, right? With the first nose and second nose and whatnot. And I was talking about that with a very senior marketing executive, and he said, "Oh, whatever you do, don't do it. Don't smoke, because, you may reawaken a dormant addiction and not be able to extricate yourself from that." And so I think that was a way in which there's just a pervasive sense of people being like part victim and part perpetrator in this
Mm.
commodity chain. Um, Whether it's the, women workers who they taught me to put the cigarettes, into the paper packaging. They said, this is like wrapping paper, and you're wrapping a little present. And that wrapping paper, though, it has like autopsied lungs on it, and images of people who've had a, tracheotomy and things like that. And so yeah, that's where the kind of idea of the gift having that like German dimension of being poison sort of comes to the fore. And those women workers, most of them, their husbands smoked, their sons smoked. They weren't themselves like, you know, um, first-hand smokers for the most part, but certainly, secondhand. And scientists also tell us about third-hand smoking as well. Um, yes, people who worked in the mechanized factories and really valued the work were nevertheless, some of them desperate. Like, how do I stop smoking? Like, I really appreciate this work, but do you have any tips about how I can stop smoking? Or the profound disappointment of a non-smoking worker when they learned that their teenage son was smoking and hiding it, and mom discovered it in their laundry. Um, so in that regard, I would say that there is actually very widespread kind of acceptance of that message about this is bad for you. At the same time, you do have the more extreme Kretek nationalists, and who are creating doubt. saying that that those images on the packet, the warning images, those come from Thailand. They're Thai lungs, not Indonesian lungs. They weren't smoking clove cigarettes. And then holding up as well this sort of like dissident science that says, oh, the clove cigarette is actually a cure for rather than a cause of cancers. And if you just apply this special filter to your cigarette, then it's going to confer even more benefits. And I think that, that did create, like, even among like some, very well-educated people that I talked to, also doctors in factory polyclinics, this like ability to say, well, we're not really sure. And of course, there's that very long history of the tobacco industry manufacturing doubt, as critics have pointed out, that was then taken up by the fossil fuel industry to create a sense of there being like not this overwhelming consensus, but like different perspectives that demand equal weight in public discourse around, whether or not this is a serious health hazard. So,
Prof, I wonder if we could go back, as they say in baseball commentary, a decade earlier to your first book. And what I wanted to do was ask you a couple of things about that first book, and then, by way of closing, invite you to add anything you want. So once you've answered my questions, if there's something you want to mention that we have already traversed, but where there's more to be said, or there's something that I've missed out on that you want to mention, that would be the opportunity to do so. Does that sound all right as a means of bringing things to a close? Yeah, okay. So your first book is also based in that part of the world. And I wondered if you could tell us why Indonesia? I mean, were you a Gertz girl?
oh, no. Yeah, I guess this does go back actually to family biography. So, my father worked in extractive industries. He
Right.
was a mechanical engineer for Bechtel Building, which is a privately owned company, not a publicly traded company, unless that status has changed. So he was working on oil and natural gas pipelines and sent to projects around the world. And in that context, we as a family lived in Australia for 7 years and moved around to different parts of Australia while he was working on various projects there. And I think that kind of sowed my interest in how is it that, we get connected to people and environments in far-flung places.
Mm.
Um, and then also when you live in Australia, you just have so much more of an awareness of Indonesia as well. So I had that as well. And then when I was an undergrad, I ended up doing some helping out doing some bird research in West Papua, and that made me really interested in the situation and the resource extraction as well as nationalist movements that had been suppressed, independence movements that had been suppressed there. So I was kind of interested in actually doing a project there. But in the sort of immediate post Suharto era, that was not feasible. And so then, a friend connected me with the idea of working on Newmont in Sumbawa. And that was the kind of twisty little path that led to
Right.
that
Oh, no,
project.
that's great. Thanks. And uh, we mentioned Ben Anderson earlier. I mean, he was banned from Indonesia for decades by the
Yeah.
Suharto people. So one of the areas you engage with very powerfully in this book is the discourse of corporate social responsibility. And it's something I've always been very skeptical of, cynical about, dismissive of. In this instance, and more generally, what's your take?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because it's another one of those terms that we're skeptical and cynical about, like environment, society, and governance in broader, and that's sort of how it became reformulated anyway. But in broader sort of corporate and finance discourse, right? But that now is banned by Republicans. So
Yes.
so
Corporations are doing it, but on the down low. Instead
and
of
DEI
broadcasting it
maybe.
hypocritically, well, some of them say they're doing it on the down low.
Yeah. So, I think that it's it's never about, assuming that anything that is done under the sign of CSR is done for some pure at heart motives, which I think is often the sort of yardstick that people apply. Well, the company doesn't really care about this, because all they want to do is generate profits for their shareholders. Um, and I guess I take more of a like I think that it has to be whenever CSR is being asserted, you have to look at like what is the very specific, industry specific, geographic specific, history specific like project that we're actually talking about. In Sumbawa at the Batu Hijau mine that I was studying, the company did engage in a lot of development projects and was kind of acting like this surrogate state in some ways, in terms of its, building of infrastructure projects, roads and schools and whatnot, and then, doing women's literacy and health projects, working with farmers. And you could find all kinds of instrumental reasons why they were doing it. And I think that the sort of simplest articulation of that the CSR experts themselves, that were hired by the company by Newmont, came up with, they were like, look, if local people use roadblocks to shut down our mine for a single day, that's going to cost us $1 million. Nice round figure, right? That's going to cost us $1 million. And so we need to manage our social relations and manage local residents' like expectations and desires so that that doesn't occur. And so I wrote about this as a way of kind of, if you can say that a mining company that is having profoundly environmentally and socially disruptive effects in a particular place, is also engaged in certain kinds of activities that are meant to ameliorate or reduce that or address that. That there may be a kind of like moral claim that that local people have on the company. And so it can really be a way of economizing what is a moral relationship to say, well, whether we like it or not, this is going to cost us $1 million a day potentially if we don't manage it. So I use that lens, and I think, yeah, in any, if you look at any company, what is the nature of, what they're claiming as corporate social responsibility? How does that tie to their core business? And the actors who are, within companies, like making those arguments, I think that they feel like, in the company, they're like advocating, or some of them at any rate feel like that. They're advocating for, say, local residents' interests or something like that, against the short-sightedness of the executives. But when they go to the local residents, then they're also, they're speaking on behalf of the company, and they're always trying to like shrink the and channel and very instrumentally use too, the projects that are going to actually exist in this local community. So But people can also see themselves as sort of moles, like, like they're going in there to achieve their agendas, to get hired by the company in order to act as a local patron, for example.
For sure, for sure.
So the corporation in this sense is not quite as self-determining as we sometimes, might imagine it to be.
One of the other things you take on in the book is bourgeois economics theory of the firm, and you criticize, or at least you engage, the notion of an extrapolation from the ratiocinative consumer seeking sovereignty over her or his purchases onto how companies function. And for many of us, that may not only be a problematic theory of the firm, but it's a problematic theory of the person, because it leaves out lots of important questions like craziness, religion, indebtedness, custom, you name it. So could you explain for us a little bit what you think is perhaps questionable about the theory of the firm as based on this rational actor model?
Yeah, so well, I feel like it is such I mean, I guess yeah, shorthanded as the Homo economicus, which yeah, is so kind of limited, just even when we think about it, with regard to humans, that, we're not contradictory. And I think, even within, fairly mainstream economics, recognizing that people have limited knowledge, that people maybe, have different utilities that they're wanting to maximize. And then this also gets applied to the shareholder, who's seen as, I think of it as like the sort of mythical reference point of corporate sort of shareholder discourse. So somebody who's seen as, because you're a shareholder, you just want to maximize your profits. But if you just simply ask, like, over what time frame do you want to do that? Like, already that really complicates the picture. Is it just in Q1, or do you care about 5 years from now when your kid goes to college, or 15 years from now when you retire, or the fact that we are not only shareholders who are seeking profits, but we also breathe air, that we would like to be clean, and drink water. So we have these other facets to us. So I think that when that simplistic model, kind of extraordinarily, that gets applied to corporations, who, I think that there is a powerful drive to kind of hold them responsible and blame them for the tremendous harms that they do unleash upon the world. And so it's, tempting to like turn to that model and understand their actions through that. But it does lead to kind of reinforcing that expectation, that, of course, they should behave as badly as they possibly can. If it's cheaper to pollute and violate the law and pay the fine than it is to abide by the law, then they should pollute and pay the
Mm,
fine.
mhm. Yeah.
And so it licenses like the very worst behavior imaginable. And I think then it forecloses the kind of historically contingent way in which that shareholder driven, shareholder value model of the corporation came into existence. And it also takes the US model and kind of universalizes it. So it's troubling in that way. And then also just, I think, for our own analytic capacities, and understanding of how things unfold, if we sort of put that cart before the horse of, understanding how it is that corporations cause all of this harm in the world. and the specificity of that in particular cases, then I think that reduces our own ability to understand these extraordinarily powerful and significant actors. Actors, again, who now, under the current Trump administration, there's interesting reformulations where there's, state exercise of power from a Republican administration that I think would have been kind of unthinkable in past decades. So,
Wonderful, Prof. I've learned so much from your work and even more from talking to you about it today. Is there anything you'd like to add? As I said, it could be retraversing terrain we've touched on, or it might be something that we haven't discussed.
nothing that I would like to add. I guess I'm just a little bit curious if I could ask you a question. Um, so I'm just interested in, like looking at your podcast, like it's so broad and eclectic, like, to what it's not the narrow sort of rendering necessarily of what cultural studies is. And so I'm interested in what your method and approach is for finding the topics that you're gonna and the people that you're gonna feature
Right.
here.
So it's the sort of WTF question in a way. Well, Prof, I started out recording with people that I loved and liked. I ran out of people who did love me, had loved me, were loving me, might love me, did like me, had liked me, da 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 da. So I started doing cold calls, for example, with your good self. How did I discover the people? How do I discover the people? I look at either people whom I read about in the bourgeois media because they've written a report, or organizations, NGOs, third sector entities, or they've written a novel or some poetry or something, or they've appeared on a talk program and they've been interesting. Or I look at faculty in a range of what in the United States are called the humanities and social sciences, but normally a bit more social sciences. So people in anthropology, sociology, etc. Look down the list of names. What do they do? Does it look like they might be interested? And so I do cold calls. And that's certainly more capacious than a lot of cultural studies would be, in that I'm interested in political economy. I'm interested in all sectors of the world. I'm interested in science, in medicine, and so on. And I want to give a voice to all those things, but it's not as though people like you lack a voice, but it might be that there are some audiences out there that could benefit from listening. And certainly I could. So I think when you said eclectic, you could have said idiosyncratic or crazed, and that would have been pretty reasonable. So it's really about anything that just fascinates me and where there is excellent work being done that really draws me in. And in some cases, people have heard of me, and that helps. In a lot of cases, they haven't, and it doesn't help, and they don't participate, and some do. And I'm lucky that you've been one of them.
Well, thank you for the cold call. Appreciate
It
it.
was a great pleasure. As I said, your work is absolutely fantastic. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.